Welcome to this Q&A session. Its purpose is to respond to questions that people have about long-term COVID-19, a very real entity emerging from this pandemic. My name is William O'Neill. I'm a retired general surgeon and intensive care unit director who carried out surgical research in various domains in the past. Since its unfortunate arrival, I have followed and studied events related to this pandemic. Links to those findings will be provided. As we will discover, the questions submitted require answers that vary from very direct, like this one, to a bit more complicated. As with this slide, rather than reading everything that appears on it, I'm going to give you the opportunity and the time to read what is written. So when there's silence, don't think that your sound system or the presentations has gone haywire. Just take the time to read. There's a lot of information to convey here. "7 months is a long time to be sick. 24 months is even longer. Your grandparents never told you about this one. When it appears that suddenly 1,744,300 people in Belgium have long-term COVID-19, the first thing that the healthcare system did and continues to do is to ignore them. If that worked so far for the government's socialized medical system, I think that's about to come to an end. And it didn't appear suddenly either. But they've wasted much time. Gender differences in the incidence of long-term COVID-19 have been confirmed in most studies of the topic during the past year. Most explanations for this finding remain hypothetical. I'll suggest an explanation. Gender differences in autoimmune illness rates remains a popular explanation for the gender differences seen in long-term COVID-19. The hypothesis is that since illnesses like Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or multiple sclerosis, or juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, or others are autoimmune in etiology with female predominance, the virus must turn on cellular autoimmunity more easily in females. That may not be enough of an explanation. Stay with me on this one, it gets a little complicated. Mitochondria seem to perform differently in the cells of men and women for several parameters that have been measured. Damage to mitochondria due to the virus may be more frequently apparent in women than men with long-term COVID-19, affecting these differences in usual mitochondrial function. What you're seeing is from a study of gender differences in mitochondrial number and function. First, in peripheral blood cells, like a lymphocyte or a monocyte, more of what a mitochondrion is designed to do in mononuclear cells of women. And in brain, the same result. NAA provides a useful way of measuring brain metabolism without removing a piece of brain, which most subjects appreciate. The final word on uncoupling hydrogen ion transport may be linked to more autoimmune diseases in women. All of this to say that long-term COVID being more present in women may also have a place here. So, a specific location in mitochondria, our sources of energy, is broken, more broken in women than men. That same location has been shown to respond to red light of a certain wavelength. I think the next question is the right one. Here, from our flyby 2 years ago, found at ltcovid.com, and simply driving home the previous message, I think mitochondrial damage is at the center of long-term COVID-19. I'll give you the time to read. Here we're inside one mitochondrium. 4 complexes of the electron transport chain feeding substrate to the spinning ATP synthase turbine at the end, which adds an inorganic phosphorus to ADP to make ATP. Anything one eats must get converted to ATP, our only final energy molecule. There is no other source. More yellow dots on one side of the inner membrane than the other are hydrogen ions creating the turning force for the turbine, like water flowing over a mill wheel. Amazing, isn't it? Next, we'll show how this list of steps was applied in November 2020 to the responses given by participants with long-term COVID-19. Focus here more on this stepwise method than the actual numbers. If those numbers seem small to you when compared with marketing studies that include thousands of participants, for example, small group statistical methods come to the rescue to dependably find differences where they exist. The data comparisons for the following comments are from November 2020 and the months before, presented then as now at ltcovid.com. Gender differences are one of many comparisons to be made when gathering data with a questionnaire. Even though 2 years ago the number of respondents was under 150, small group statistical methods applied at that time already permitted distinguishing gender-based differences that could be sorted by how significant those differences actually were. Looking for such differences looks like this. Statistical control said that differences were very significant or significant statistically when comparing men and women with long-term COVID-19, including that men did not feel like they were breathing differently as part of this illness. The interval to recurrence of the illness when it had improved was shorter in men than in women. Male respondents were younger in age, and the average number of symptoms while ill was fewer in males than females. Taking this variable by variable is not what we can do now. There were some differences that were perhaps significant, and these should not be ignored. But was there a big picture here? Here is a summary of gender-based differences for 57 different variables that were studied in those with long-term COVID-19. For 80% of these variables at that time, no statistically significant differences were found, but there were statistically significant differences identified for certain variables and as shown. Why look at this again now? The results for these differences were probably valid then and are probably 2 years later still valid. So the question remains, where to from here? My opinion is that these 2-year-old data help one to understand where science and scientific research and medical practice are currently positioned. The search for such differences is still very much on. Characterization has not yet reached a point of completion. In the past 2 years, these domains have in fact caught up. But caught up with what? With confirming that the differences, such as these defined 2 years ago for those with long-term COVID-19, are in fact real. Science, of course, asks the question why. That's an appropriate question. And first of all, here we presented 57 different variables. There are certainly more variables, but one must first select which one or ones to pursue. That quickly gets into owners of a variable and return on investment for funding. Pursuit means making observations in a controlled setting and objectively judging the results. I think of that process as dissecting. But at some point, it becomes time to close the wound and judge the results, the outcome of an intervention. This is a way of saying that science and medicine are at present still focused on the why question, and not yet on the but what are we going to do about it aspect of safe and possible effective interventions for those still in need. I prefer to combine the two, and as long as it is safe, test an intervention to see if it can offer relief to those still suffering long-term COVID-19. At present, that represents intervening with red and near-infrared low-level light, also known as photobiomodulation. But if my positioning of the scientific response to long-term COVID-19 is correct, it means that one should not expect to see major breakthroughs very soon. This is, of course, just as true for discussions and comparisons of BAME populations and other social and economic sectors that are impacted by long-term COVID-19 and should plan on being impacted even more. So the application of the scientific method back in November 2020 clearly suggested that long-term COVID-19 would pose significant problems for many who had become infected with this virus. After spending 2 years, that same very concerning result has been confirmed by medicine and science, but at present, further confirmation may not be what is most needed. Safe interventions should be sought and tried for those with long-term COVID-19. Application targets: safety first, effectiveness second. Both are, of course, essential. Take the time to read the highlighted information from this article a few days old in The Lancet. You should get the message that past findings obtained from listening to patients have been confirmed. So, do more studies for confirmation, or begin to lean towards possibly helpful interventions? You'll see next how the editor voted. We should now get beyond confirming what others have already confirmed, which is that, too often, it can be an unpleasant illness of long duration. Equally or more disturbing is that a study published recently in June 2022 identified that infants born to women who were positive for SARS-CoV-2 and themselves positive had a high frequency of neurodevelopmental abnormalities and delay when evaluated 1 year after their birth. So this is a very pertinent question. And the answer, as with so much that pertains to the future of this condition, is veiled in uncertainty. Waiting for full illumination of this setting means, I believe, unacceptable delay in relieving suffering. The long list of symptoms that patients presented with were, of course, the main thing that stumped the primary care providers around the world. As we'll also mention, the patients' lists shared multiple new emotional as well as new physical symptoms. It took 2 years for the long-term COVID-19 clinics to open their doors. Even at places like Yale and Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, and Cambridge, the big boys moved like snails. In a critical care setting, a patient with 3 or more organ systems that have failed will probably never make it out of the ICU alive. Here, in long-term COVID-19, when symptoms are reorganized by organ systems, these respondents had 5 or 6 organ systems involved. That means an illness impacting essentially the whole body. And if duration is long, thankfully, severity remains below levels of system failure. A good question and an important clue for how to approach the therapy in long-term COVID-19. Some might think that loss of sense of smell is a minor inconvenience, but in fact, several studies have confirmed that diminution of sense of smell, most often occurring with increasing age, is in fact associated with increased mortality rates. Perhaps we should try to maintain and protect all the sensory faculties that we were born with. Brain substance is easily injured by any interruption of its energy sources. This may quickly bring to mind the tragic effects of a stroke due to impaired blood supply from a blocked artery or a clot. But more basic than that, the neurons and glial or supportive cells of the brain do not tolerate well any interruption in the flow of energy supplied to meet their metabolic demands. These demands are of course met in health by intact mitochondria creating impressive amounts of ATP locally in the brain. The coronavirus damages that. And that sounds like brain fog in the making. I'll just let you read this one. Take your time. Here are 15 symptoms, such as those obtained through our questionnaire in 2020, here regrouped as chronic neurologic symptoms. Not just effects in central brain, but symptomatic findings due to involved neurons in the periphery. And effects noted on the autonomic nervous system are discernible, since the control of heartbeats and blood pressure and body temperature, one could also add digestive findings, are carried to and from the periphery by nerves that may also be involved with these problems of cellular energetics. Seeing it that way avoids the arguments of direct viral damaging effects versus abnormal immune responsiveness. The autonomic nervous system. Obviously, another 3-day lecture series. The nerves of the parasympathetic division emerge at the base of the brain. Those of the sympathetic division emerge from spinal cord and ganglia along its length next to the spinal vertebrae. Clearly, normal function of all organs depends on an intact system with the two divisions in balance. And yes, it's as complicated as it looks, more so. These nerves are also all equipped, of course, with mitochondria. And when the virus causes damage, the findings will be quite variable and hard to diagnose. The patient may simply say, "I just don't feel right. I just don't have the energy I used to have. I feel 100 years old." Neuroplasticity is an encouraging word since it presents the idea that damaged brain neurons can accomplish some repair, different from what I was taught in medical school way back in the 70s. But does coronavirus 2 infection result in actual brain substance loss and related effects on thinking? Let's walk through one study that addressed those questions. A group of infected COVID-19 patients and a non-infected control group, studied with brain scans and cognitive tests. 2 testing periods to compare results over time. Results placed in context since some brain cell loss in memory centers over time is normal in adults. As medicine has become more specialized, a complete physical exam, even if done rapidly, may now be a thing of the past. Even general practitioners seem to have other things to accomplish during a consultation than to check visual acuity, a simple procedure. This slide seems headed in several different directions at the same time. That reflects the feeling I have about where we are in this pandemic. As various vaccines and oral therapies have appeared, the results are less well controlled scientifically, and increasingly hampered by more and more variables. After 2 years of caution, someone may get infected for the first time. Others have had it 3 times, though vaccinated 3 times. Others finish their Paxlovid 5 days of immunotherapy and have a relapse a week later with the same virus. Very disconcerting, but not new. The history of the treatment of tuberculosis and syphilis therapy are good historical examples. More uncertainty. Well, it's a foundation of infectious disease. If multiomics are a mystery for you, here's a place to start. Multiomics refers to a method of using clusters of similar or identical cells to apply challenges and techniques aimed at answering questions about how tissues and organs made up of those cells will respond. Respond not only to challenges like a virus, through antibodies produced, for example, but also to potential effectiveness of therapies. This is out of my field of expertise. Multiomics is literally headed for space travel, and the provided link may help one to further understand. Here's a bit more to read. No need to adjust your sound system. Another good and related question. And with it, you've just entered your first day of your internal medicine clerkship. Welcome. To answer this question, one must first understand how medicine usually works. The practice of medicine identifies problems, names them, that's a diagnosis, and generally feels that it applies the best methods for fixing the problem. Here's how that might play out when one combines diabetes mellitus and long-term COVID-19 in the same person. This is a way of sharing that the practice of medicine is guided by principles that theoretically evolve through scientific discovery and application. But is it actually attuned to the whole person? For instance, here, the person with expertise in surgery, intensive care, and surgical research may be starting to paddle out into deeper waters where expertise is certainly limited. No sociology nor public health degrees. And yet, since I'm that person, during my training and subsequent practice, it was somehow ingrained or incorporated that fixing the medical or surgical problem, doing that well, would permit the person who had been ill to return to a normal life. But just how normal was the life to which the patient, now medically or surgically repaired, going to be returning to? For now, I'll keep paddling a bit. This is, of course, two questions. I think a good response requires placing them both in a context that precedes them on a timeline. As you see here, in 1899, the sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that the health problems for those of his race were being viewed with, and I quote, such peculiar indifference. He is here being quoted in a very good article on racial inequities in health. Du Bois wrote of, quote, Negro health, and if asked, would have responded that he was a Negro. For the ears of many hearing this today, a suggestion might be given, more or less politely, that that term Negro should be replaced with Black or Afro or African American, or perhaps some other. My personal reaction as I read this was that our society seems to have succeeded in classifying a person in a polite manner deemed acceptable to the majority. Simultaneously, I think we continue to fail miserably in rectifying racial inequities in health. For me, the, quote, peculiar indifference, close quotes, that Du Bois wrote about in describing racial differences in health has not moved much since 1899, and may very well have gotten worse. In this article's abstract, one quickly comes upon the words racism and discrimination. And do these words still help to understand the problem, or are they now buzzwords with problems for many listeners? Getting closer, one finds disparities in the external effects of the contextual social space, matched to effects on the internal world of brain functioning and physiologic response. Sociology and medicine in search of one another. So let's accept that mysterious dyad for a moment and see if we can get even closer. We accept the risk of quickly getting too far afield from our subject, long-term COVID-19, but forge ahead. Here, experts in the field are closing in on reporting that structural racism, the historically evolving context that gives us our world today, and here the example is American, can now be translated into an individual body's undesirable responses to that structure and resultant development of illness. Overall mortality rates, or life expectancy estimates if you prefer, are improving over time in the USA, as in many other developed countries. This seems to be true in the US for both genders, as well as for different races and ethnicities. Simultaneously, an approximate 7-year difference in life expectancy between white males and black males, to select one example, seems to persist. In the last 3 decades, this difference seems to have narrowed. There have been bumps in the road which made some in those moments cry like Chicken Little that the life expectancy sky was now falling. The pandemic has served as a reminder of how fragile this apparent improvement in life expectancy may actually be. In the past, and certainly for more than 100 years, disparities in health outcomes and health status tended towards biologic explanations for the differences perceived and measured between races and ethnicities. Biologic explanations have fallen out of favor. Instead, since biologic explanations in the distant past were often found to be poorly studied, invented, frankly biased, or all three, the domains of sociology, public health, and even psychology have moved into that void. To place this in context, I will quickly summarize terms that one can find in the literature from those fields. Notice that I did not include government as a driver to reduce disparities in health outcomes. Policies aimed at reducing fundamental socioeconomic inequalities are currently practically absent in the United States, says the sociology literature. Even the current government-sponsored push for testing and vaccination is fraught with fundamental inequalities that remind that making change at a public level is always a challenge. Much of the currently observed difference in life expectancy between the races is primarily linked to differences in chronic disease rates and injuries of all types. Whatever public health strategies have been put in place, they have yet to make this difference in life expectancy disappear. Looking through the related literature, the following terms appear frequently like chapter headings, which they frequently are, presented as probable causes of health disparities and inequalities, and from there as potential targets for public health policy and societal work. These terms are presented without judgment. I do not have the training nor expertise to place myself in that position. But I find this approach essential to answering the question about BAME, people of color, and their lived, and including deaths, experience with COVID-19. Their health status before the pandemic had and has a strong impact on outcomes during the pandemic to this day, and including long-term COVID-19 rates, lived experience, and outcomes from contact with the healthcare system. Here are some of these terms. With more time, we would give each the attention it deserves. The bibliography from which they are drawn, which I have made available, should certainly make further study a bit easier. As this list of terms passes before your eyes, know that they are carefully described, selected, and defined in the literature of sociology and public health. But must we still agree with W.E.B. Du Bois' summary phrase of peculiar indifference? Or rather, a problem now grown so large and multifaceted that there may not be an attainable solution. Chipping away at each cause of disparity in health outcomes one by one. Is that the way to fix this? And are statements like eliminate poverty simply naive? Current events in the USA make it clear that divisions that ultimately impact on health are all too present today. We just saw multiple potential contributors to disparity and inequity in health outcomes for people of color. Here, differences in expected survival by gender and race may present a bottom-line metric for confirming the ultimate effect of such disparity. Mean values for these data find a difference of about 7 years between white and black males and 6.4 years for female life expectancy. The differences were smaller in later years. Without dissecting down to specific differences by race and ethnicity for diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, smoking-related illnesses and cancers, low birth weight births, these are ultimately reflected in mortality and survival statistics. So using this metric, are things getting better or worse? Let me help with this. Overall, life expectancy in blacks was lower than in whites since quite a while. In recent decades, that has been improving. Though still smaller than in the past, most recent values suggest that disparity worsened. Who can say if that will continue and fall outside of a standard deviation or not? Not I. To help to counter an overly pessimistic view, these data from the years 1970 to 2017 clearly show an increase in life expectancy for all groups, even if the disparity between groups persists. So now we move from the baseline or background of chronic health problems and disparities that have links since many years to societal and socioeconomic findings to finally address the question, what about BAME, or people of color, and acute COVID-19? Parenthetically, grouping different racial and ethnic groups under the one heading of BAME may contribute to missing important findings that contribute to health outcomes in the Latino or Asian populations specifically, for example. Omissions today are due especially to essential time limits, which are already being strained. Here are some examples of where differences exist in the settings of acute COVID-19 illness. So, where are we in this? Outcomes from COVID-19 in BAME populations cannot and should not be separated from pre-pandemic, societally influenced, poor health status. Then we saw how that played out through several undesired outcomes for BAME populations when a greater risk for contracting COVID-19 played out as increased case numbers, severity, and death rates. But to get to the last part of this question, what about BAME populations and long-term COVID-19, or PASC if you prefer? The two prior settings hint that even worse long-term outcomes should be anticipated. What do the data say? Studies like this one of PASC are not yet ready to give answers on long-term COVID-19 and findings related to race or ethnicity. These are not answers, but questions to be pursued with further research. Search the literature and you may discover, as I did, that this is where things are now. This present void of information is actually not too surprising. It has taken 2 years for established science and allopathic medicine to accept long-term presentations of COVID-19 as real and begin to catch up. Earliest reports were that it was a form of anxiety. That last phrase can be taken in several ways. When I was a surgical resident, I learned, as others did, to parrot this when a patient presented with very advanced disease that our surgeries had little hope of fixing. Doing more tests to establish this with great precision was not going to change outcome. Applied to the early days of long-term COVID-19, physicians felt that if they didn't have a fix for this illness of long duration, what good was there in pursuing that diagnosis? They were missing the fact that the goal should be to relieve suffering and heal the sick where possible. In the first case, specific knowledge led to saying this phrase for the patient's benefit. In the second, total ignorance of the causal factors and management principles led to similar non-action, but out of professional frustration. The patients didn't miss this. The person who asked this question may in fact have some of the same illness as the practitioners being referred to. There is no lead shield between one's emotions and the rest of the physical body. At least, I never found one. Can you imagine? In addition to all your physical complaints, having on average 7 different emotional complaints or symptoms to go along with the rest? Another great reason to avoid catching this monster. When we asked this 2 years ago, we gave respondents a slider to gauge, between 0 and 100, effectiveness of emotional support for their situation and from several possible sources. Here, the average values, responses turned into a score, and those expressed as percentages. So for emotional support effectiveness, therapists came in last. A person's physician, not much better. Family, online groups, and personal habits, for example meditation, beat out the therapists and medical practitioners by quite a bit. Most interesting, 76% of respondents skipped the question on effectiveness of therapists. Couldn't get an appointment or didn't even try. So this graph is presenting a quite acceptable level of natural immunity of around 85% and increasing. But, as you'll see next, that's just one study. And there are others to contradict this. Most articles today suggest vaccination will not make long-term COVID-19 behave any differently. So, up-to-the-minute conclusions? These are presented as new findings, which means that the present continues to confirm the findings on long-term COVID-19 as discovered 2 years ago. Then, there was no urgency. Now, there seems to be. And at Fair Health Insurance System, the concern that this group of patients will continue to consume large amounts of resources, increasing costs, is freely shared. Thank you very much for your attention right up to this terminal point. And if at times it seemed long, that is after all the character of this illness for those who have yet to beat it. We hope to help with that. Remember the foundation of compassionate care. Relieve suffering and heal the sick where possible. Thanks again.